There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them without realizing it. It lives in the image of a soldier standing in a field of poppies, in the phrase, "the war to end all wars," in the bronze statues outside train stations, in the careful language of memorials that say, "gave their lives," instead of, "had their lives taken." That version is a story built on distance. Distance from the mud. Distance from the smell. Distance from the administrative machinery that processed human beings like inventory and logged their destruction in ledgers that have since been archived, catalogued, and largely forgotten. That version of the war is not a lie exactly, but it is a careful arrangement of facts that leaves out the texture of what actually happened. And the texture is where the truth lives. World War I did not begin with heroism. It began with mobilization schedules. It began with railway timetables so precise and so politically locked that once the order was given in the summer of 1914, military planners told their governments that the trains could not be stopped without collapsing the entire operation. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for a two-front war, required moving more than 3 million men by rail in a matter of weeks. The plan did not account for the enemy adapting. It did not account for mud. It accounted for speed. And when speed failed, when the front lines hardened into trenches in the autumn of 1914, the entire industrial logic of the war was forced to recalculate. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas became something that had no model, no precedent, and no end in sight. What replaced it was a system, not a strategy in the traditional sense. A system for sustaining casualties indefinitely while maintaining the appearance of forward progress. And within that system, the 25 realities of this war were not aberrations. They were features. They were what the war became when it was left to operate on its own logic. The first of these realities is the trench itself, and what living inside one actually meant over time. The image that survives in photographs is already distressing. The reality was worse in ways that photographs could not capture because photographs could not convey smell. The trenches on the Western Front stretched more than 400 miles from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. They were dug in stages, expanded, collapsed, redug, and layered over time into a network that in some sectors ran 6 or 7 lines deep. The front trench, the support trench, the reserve trench, the communication trenches connecting them. Soldiers moved through this underground geography like blood through a system of veins. The trenches were not temporary. They were permanent, and permanence meant accumulation. Mud accumulated first. The clay soil of Flanders and the Somme Valley retained water with extraordinary efficiency. After rain, and it rained frequently, the trenches became canals of grey-brown slurry that could reach a man's waist. Wooden duckboards were laid along the trench floors, but they sank, they floated, they became slick with algae and body matter. Men fell off them in the dark. Some drowned in the mud before anyone could reach them. There are accounts from soldiers on both sides of men sinking slowly into shell craters filled with water and mud, calling out and being impossible to extract without pulling them apart. The rescuers had to make calculations. Sometimes the calculation was to let go. Rats accumulated second. The rat population of the Western Front is difficult to estimate because it grew so fast and in such direct proportion to the number of unrecovered bodies. Rats in the trenches were not rats as most people encountered them, small and skittish. They were large, bold, and extraordinarily well fed. They ate the dead. They ate the food stores. They ran across sleeping men. They gnawed through kit bags and ammunition pouches. Some soldiers reported waking to find rats sitting on their chests, staring. The rats were not a minor inconvenience. They were a constant biological presence that soldiers spent significant energy managing and largely failed to manage because the conditions that produced them could not be changed. Lice accumulated third. Almost every soldier on the Western Front had lice within weeks of arriving. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in body hair, in the material of greatcoats and blankets. Delousing stations existed behind the lines, but men returned to the trenches and were reinfested within days. The procedure for dealing with lice was called chatting. a word that came to mean running a candle flame along the seams of a uniform to kill the eggs. It was not effective at scale. Lice caused more than discomfort. They transmitted trench fever, a bacterial infection that caused intense bone pain, high fever, and recurring relapses that could last months. The causative agent, Bartonella quintana, was not identified until 1915, and the mechanism of transmission was not confirmed until 1918, by which point millions of men had already been infected. The medical apparatus of the war treated trench fever as a logistics problem. Sick men were cycled out, rested when possible, and returned. The lice were never controlled. The second reality is what happened to the concept of time inside the trench system. Time in the trenches did not move the way time moves in ordinary life. It did not progress toward anything. Men stood to at dawn and stood to at dusk, the two most dangerous moments when attacks were most likely. Between those two stand-tos, they existed. They slept in dugouts cut into the trench walls, small rooms of earth held up by timber frames that sweated moisture and sagged under bombardment. They ate when food came. They waited. The waiting was not passive. It was an active psychological state, because at any moment a shell could land in the trench. At any moment a sniper could find a gap. The waiting had no rhythm and no release, because the danger never fully withdrew. And that constant, unresolvable alertness produced a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep could not fix. Men slept and woke up as tired as when they had lain down, because the nervous system does not rest when it believes death is near. Soldiers described this state in their letters home, in the language available to them, which was often inadequate. They wrote that they were tired. They wrote that things were rough. The censors reviewed letters before they left the lines, and explicit descriptions of suffering or tactical information were cut. What got through was a sanitized transcript of experience, which created a second layer of isolation. The men in the trenches could not say what was happening to them. The people at home could not understand what was not being said. And the gap between those two positions grew wider as the war continued, until soldiers on leave reported feeling more alienated in London or Paris or Berlin than they had in the trenches. At least in the trenches, everyone around them was experiencing the same thing. Civilian life had continued in its ordinary shape, and returning to it felt unreal. The third reality concerns the mechanics of the artillery bombardment, and what it actually did to the human body and the human mind simultaneously. Artillery was the dominant weapon of World War I in terms of casualties caused. More men were killed and wounded by artillery fire than by any other means. The guns ranged from field artillery that fired shells the size of a man's forearm to heavy siege howitzers that fired projectiles weighing nearly a ton. The British used over 170 million shells during the war. The Germans fired comparable quantities. The French exceeded both. The sheer volume of metal moved through the air and into the ground during World War I represents an industrial output that had no historical parallel. What a heavy bombardment actually felt like to the men underneath it cannot be adequately described in ordinary language, and soldiers knew this. The sound was not a bang or a boom. It was a pressure event. A nearby shell detonation produced a concussive wave that moved through the body as a physical force. It compressed organs. It rattled the skull. It disrupted the fluid of the inner ear in ways that caused disorientation, nausea, and temporary or permanent hearing loss. Men caught in sustained bombardments described losing the ability to think in linear sequences. Language broke down. The capacity to process what was happening disconnected from the sensory experience of it. Men lay in shell craters and dugouts and ceased to be fully conscious in any coherent sense while remaining physically awake. This state was documented by medical officers who had no established category for it. The term that emerged was shell shock, a phrase coined in 1915 by Charles Myers, a British psychologist working with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Myers initially believed the symptoms, which included uncontrollable tremors, inability to speak, Paralysis with no physical cause, nightmares, and a glazed, unresponsive affect were caused by actual concussive damage to the nervous system from shell blasts. Later work suggested the cause was psychological, the result of overwhelming and sustained terror. The army was not interested in the distinction. Shell shock was administratively inconvenient. Men who could not function were a resource problem, and the institution's response to resource problems was standardization. The fourth reality is what the military institution did with men who broke down. It is a reality that remained officially suppressed for decades after the war and is still not fully integrated into popular understanding of the conflict. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during World War I for offenses that included desertion, cowardice, and related charges. The French Army executed 600 and odd of its soldiers, with the exact number still contested. The German Army's records are less complete. What is documentable is that the threshold for execution was not always mens rea, criminal intent in the legal sense. It was often simply the inability to return to the line. Men who refused to go over the top were court-martialed. The proceedings were brief. The legal representation was minimal or non-existent. Officers who knew the men who had observed their deterioration over weeks or months were sometimes called as witnesses, but the institutional pressure ran in one direction. Desertion in the face of the enemy was a capital offense. The line between desertion and psychological collapse was not a line that military law of the era recognized with any precision. Men who had not slept for days, who were shaking uncontrollably, who could not speak, were marched before firing squads composed of their own comrades. The firing squad was designed with a specific institutional logic in mind. One rifle in the squad was loaded with a blank, so that no individual soldier could be certain he had fired a killing shot. The accountability was distributed. The act was collective and therefore individually deniable. It was efficient. The fifth reality concerns gas, and not the dramatic deployment of it that films tend to show. Gas warfare began in April 1915 when the German army released chlorine gas at Ypres. The initial attack caused panic and a temporary breakthrough that the Germans were not prepared to exploit because no one had anticipated that the gas would work so effectively. The development of gas weaponry after that point was an arms race between delivery mechanisms, chemical compounds, and protective equipment. By 1917, the dominant agents were no longer chlorine, but phosgene, which was responsible for the majority of gas fatalities, and mustard gas, which was responsible for the majority of gas casualties overall. Mustard gas is a vesicant, a blister agent. It does not kill quickly. It destroys tissue on contact, including the tissue of the eyes, the skin, the respiratory tract, and the digestive system. Men exposed to mustard gas in sufficient concentrations did not die at once. They were blinded, often permanently. Their skin blistered and wept fluid. The internal tissues of the throat and lungs began to break down. The process took days. Men lay in casualty clearing stations in a state of protracted injury, their eyes bandaged, unable to move without tearing open the blisters covering their bodies. Nurses who worked in gas wards reported that the environment was unlike anything in their training. There was nothing to do for many of these men except manage the process. Gas was not used only in large attacks. It became a routine instrument of harassment. Artillery shells filled with gas were fired at night into rear areas, supply depots, rest billets. The intent was not mass casualties, but exhaustion. Gas masks were hot, uncomfortable, and reduced visual acuity significantly. Wearing a gas mask while doing physical labor, moving supplies, digging, was debilitating. The constant threat of gas, the need to mask at any moment, at night, while sleeping, while eating, produced a layer of chronic stress, on top of everything else the trench environment was already generating. Gas was, in this sense, as much a psychological weapon as a lethal one, and the men who designed it understood this. The sixth reality is the medical system, and the gap between what it promised and what it could deliver. The military medical structure of World War I was genuinely innovative in some respects. The development of triage as a systematic method of sorting casualties by survivability, the use of blood transfusion, which was still experimental in 1914 and became standard by 1917, the development of reconstructive surgery for facial wounds, these were real advances. The problem was scale. The medical system was designed for a war of movement, of discrete battles with recovery periods between them. The static war of attrition that actually developed generated casualties at rates the system was not configured to handle. After major offensives, the casualty clearing stations, which were the first point of surgical care behind the lines, were overwhelmed within hours. The Battle of the Somme on July 1, 1916, produced approximately 57,000 British casualties in a single day, of whom nearly 20,000 were killed outright. The remainder, tens of thousands of wounded men, moved or were carried back through a medical system that had been organized around handling a fraction of that number. Triage in those conditions was not the careful, systematic process described in medical literature. It was a fast assessment conducted under extreme pressure by people who had been awake for too long, making life and death decisions in seconds. Men who were assessed as unlikely to survive were placed aside. Some of them survived anyway without treatment, lying in the open. Others, who might have survived with immediate treatment, did not receive it because there was no capacity. The paperwork continued regardless. Casualty reports, wound classifications, regimental records, pension assessments, all of it moved through the administrative machinery of the army at its own pace, independent of what was happening to the bodies the paperwork represented. The seventh reality is what happened to the faces. The Western Front produced a category of wound that no previous war had generated in significant numbers, because no previous war had combined artillery shrapnel, machine gun fire at close range, and barbed wire in the particular combination that characterized trench warfare. Men who went over the top and were not killed outright had a high probability of being hit in the face and head, because these were the parts of the body most exposed as men climbed out of the trench and moved across open ground. The result was facial wounds of a severity and complexity that existing surgical practice had no established methods for treating. Harold Gillies, a New Zealand-born surgeon working with the British Army, began developing techniques for facial reconstruction that would eventually become the foundation of modern plastic surgery. Gillies treated more than 5,000 cases of severe facial injury during the war. The ward at Sidcup in England that became his primary working space was organized with specific protocols for the men who lived there between surgeries, which could number in the dozens for a single patient over months or years. Mirrors were placed at specific angles to limit how much a man could see of himself during recovery stages. The local pubs and restaurants developed a custom of painting certain benches blue as a signal to the public that the person sitting there might have a face that would cause distress, so that people could prepare themselves or choose to sit elsewhere. This arrangement was presented at the time as a kindness. What it also was a management system for appearances, a way of controlling how the civilian population encountered the physical evidence of the war. The men who sat on the blue benches knew what the benches meant. They had been categorized and placed in a visible but managed space. The war continued to organize them. The eighth reality concerns the horses and what the war meant for them, because the animal dimension of World War I is often treated as a footnote when it was anything but. Approximately 8 million horses died during World War I. The British Army alone had more than 500,000 horses on the Western Front at the peak of the conflict. These animals were used for transport, for artillery, for cavalry in the early mobile phase, and for supply throughout. The conditions they worked in were the same conditions the men lived in. They stood in mud. They were exposed to gas. They were hit by shells. They drowned in shell craters. They were worked until they broke down, and then were assessed for further utility. The veterinary system of the war was extensive, not primarily out of compassion, though individual soldiers often formed powerful bonds with the animals they worked with, but because horses were equipment. An artillery horse was a strategic asset. Replacing it required shipping, feeding, and acclimatization. Repairing it was preferable to replacement. The veterinary hospitals of the Western Front were genuinely effective at returning injured horses to service, with recovery rates that in some categories exceeded those of the human medical system. But the emotional dimension of the horse's experience within this system received no administrative consideration at all. The horses suffered. They suffered visibly. Soldiers who could not openly display their own distress sometimes described their feelings about the horses with a freedom they did not permit themselves regarding their own condition. The ninth reality is the question of what officers did and did not tell their superiors, and why. The command structure of World War I operated on a flow of information that was, at every level, shaped by what the level above wanted to hear. Generals needed to show results to justify the casualties. Corps commanders needed to show progress to satisfy the generals. Division commanders needed to demonstrate that their men were performing. And all of this filtered down through battalion and company commanders to the men in the trenches, who were the ones actually executing the plans. The information moving back up through that same chain was subject to the same pressure in reverse. Failure was professionally dangerous. Success was rewarded. The result was that optimistic reports moved more freely than accurate ones. When an attack failed to achieve its objective, the reports often described partial success. When ground was taken at enormous cost and immediately retaken by the enemy, the regimental history of the event might emphasize the capture and elide the loss. General Douglas Haig's diaries, which are a primary document of the British war effort from his perspective, contain assessments of situations that differ significantly from the assessments of the men on the ground who experienced those situations. Haig was not uniquely dishonest. He was operating within an institutional logic that rewarded confidence and penalized doubt. The logic produced a persistent gap between what was reported and what was real, and that gap cost lives, because decisions made on inaccurate information produced plans that failed for the same reasons the previous plans had failed. The 10th reality is the experience of the so-called quiet sectors, and what quiet actually meant in the context of the Western Front. Popular understanding of the war tends to focus on the major battles, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, because these are the events that left the largest marks in the historical record. But the war did not consist only of major offensives. Most of the time, most men on the Western Front were in sectors that were officially classified as quiet. Quiet meant that no major offensive was underway. It did not mean safe. In a quiet sector, artillery fire continued at a lower intensity but did not stop. Sniper activity continued. Trench raids were conducted at night. Small groups of men crossing no man's land to attack enemy positions, take prisoners for intelligence purposes, and demonstrate that the sector was being actively contested. Casualties in quiet sectors accumulated at a rate that would have been considered catastrophic in any previous war. A British division holding a quiet sector might expect to lose several hundred men per week to what were officially termed wastage, a word that appears in military documents without evident irony to describe the routine death and injury of soldiers from random artillery, sniper fire, disease, and accident. Wastage. The word treats human beings as a consumable resource that diminishes through ordinary use. The 11th reality is the men who did not fight and the institutional machinery erected to compel them. The White Feather campaign in Britain, in which civilian women gave white feathers to men not in uniform as a symbol of cowardice, was not a government program, but it was tolerated and tacitly encouraged. It caused documented psychological harm to men who were not in uniform for legitimate reasons, working in essential industries, medically unfit, already veterans who had returned from the front. The institution of the Feather Campaign represented the extension of military discipline into civilian space, the enrollment of the domestic population in the enforcement of martial norms. The Military Service Act of 1916 introduced conscription in Britain. replacing the voluntary enlistment system that had produced more than 2 million volunteers by the end of 1915. Conscription brought in men who had not chosen to serve, who were assessed for fitness by medical boards that operated under pressure to pass enough men to meet the Army's requirements. The fitness standards declined as the war progressed. Men who had been rejected in 1914 as medically unfit were reclassified in 1916 and 1917. Men with flat feet, poor vision, dental problems, histories of illness that would have excluded them from any previous military service were passed as fit for general service and sent to France. The Army needed bodies, and the medical boards provided them. The 12th reality is what happened in no man's land. The space between the opposing trench systems was not a fixed geography. It varied from a few dozen yards in sectors where the lines had advanced close to each other to several hundred yards in others. It was defined by wire, by shell craters, by the bodies of men who had fallen during attacks and could not be recovered. The inability to recover the dead was one of the defining features of the static war. In a war of movement, the dead could be buried and the ground could be crossed again. In the fixed trench war, the dead in no man's land lay where they had fallen, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for the duration of the war. The decomposition of human bodies in the open, exposed to weather, was a constant environmental and psychological feature of the front. The smell was distinctive and pervasive, and not something that went away when men moved into rest areas, because it had been absorbed into clothing and equipment, and, men said, into the skin itself. The bodies became part of the landscape. They were used as landmarks. Letters from soldiers on the Somme make reference to navigating at night by the position of specific bodies. The dead were not absent from the war. They remained present in no man's land as a persistent feature of the environment. And the men who lived adjacent to them adapted their perception to accommodate this in ways that had no name and no treatment protocol. The 13th reality concerns food and how the Army managed the minimum required to sustain fighting capacity. The daily ration for a British soldier on the Western Front was specified in military regulations with considerable precision. It included biscuit or bread, bully beef in tins, tinned vegetables, tea, sugar and rum in prescribed quantities. The regulation ration was adequate in caloric terms on paper. The delivery of the regulation ration to forward positions was a different matter. The communication trenches that connected the front lines to the rear were not reliable supply routes. They were subject to shell fire, to flooding, to blockage by casualties. The carrying parties who moved supplies forward did so at night and under fire. What arrived in the forward trench was often cold, reduced in quantity, and frequently not what had been sent. Men on the line ate what arrived. They supplemented it by foraging, by purchasing from estaminets in rest areas behind the lines, by receiving parcels from home, which the postal system moved with considerable efficiency given the circumstances. The food itself became a significant emotional object. Parcels from home contained not just food, but the texture of a civilian life that was becoming increasingly abstract. Men wrote home asking for specific items with an urgency that seems disproportionate until you understand what those items represented. A tin of sardines from a London shop was not just protein. It was evidence that the world that sent it still existed. The 14th reality is the experience of returning from the line to rest areas and the particular character of that rest. Men rotated between the front line, the support trenches, the reserve line, and rest billets in villages and towns behind the front. Rest periods were not holidays. They involved equipment maintenance, training, drilling, and the full administrative apparatus of military life without the immediate threat of combat. Men who had been in the line under sustained bombardment found that the rest areas were not quiet. They had simply moved to a different frequency of noise and danger. The sound of artillery from the front was audible in rest areas. Billets were often in damaged buildings, cold and damp, and the knowledge that the rotation would bring them back to the line was present throughout. The estaminets, the small French and Belgian cafes that operated behind the lines, became important institutions. They served watered wine and eggs and chips to soldiers who had money and time. They were warm. They had civilian women in them, which represented a contact with ordinary domestic life that many men found disorienting after weeks in the trench. The relationship between soldiers and the civilian populations behind the French and Belgian lines was complex and not always comfortable. The local people were living in a war zone in which they had little agency, dependent on the military forces occupying their territory, and experiencing the destruction of their property and landscape in real time. They were not merely a backdrop to the soldiers' experience. They had their own relationship to the catastrophe unfolding around them. The 15th reality is the management of religion and what the institutional churches did with the war. The chaplains of the various national armies, British, French, German, moved through the trench system conducting services, administering last rites, writing letters to next of kin, and providing what spiritual comfort was possible within the constraints of their position. The institutional churches of the belligerent nations had largely endorsed the war as a just or necessary cause. German Protestant theology framed the war as a national and spiritual mission. The Catholic Church, with significant populations on both sides of the conflict, navigated with difficulty. The Church of England produced a body of war theology that framed sacrifice in terms of Christian redemption, Christ dying for others as a model for the soldier dying for his nation. The men in the trenches had varied relationships with this framework. Some found genuine comfort in religious practice, in the rituals of communion and prayer that provided a structure and a language for the experience of being close to death. Others rejected it entirely, finding that the gap between the rhetoric of Christian sacrifice and the reality of industrial killing was too large to bridge. The soldiers' letters and diaries contain both kinds of response, sometimes from the same person at different points in the war. What the institutional church could not fully accommodate was the specific character of this war's killing, because the theology of sacrifice assumed individual agency, the martyr choosing death for a cause, and the industrialized killing of the Western Front stripped individual agency from the process almost completely. A man killed by a random shell had not chosen his death. He had simply been in the wrong place when a calculation of artillery trajectories produced a particular result. The 16th reality is the specific experience of the major offensives and the gap between what they were supposed to achieve and what they achieved. The Somme offensive, which began on July 1, 1916, was planned by the British High Command as an operation that would break the German defensive line and allow a return to open warfare. The preliminary bombardment lasted 7 days and fired more than 1.5 million shells at the German positions. The plan was that the bombardment would destroy the wire, collapse the dugouts, and kill or stun the German defenders so thoroughly that the infantry could walk across no man's land and occupy the positions with minimal resistance. The plan failed at almost every point. The German dugouts, which were significantly deeper and better constructed than British intelligence had assessed, sheltered the defenders through the bombardment. When the shelling stopped and the whistles blew, the German machine gunners climbed out of their dugouts and set up their weapons and waited. The British infantry, ordered to advance at a walking pace to maintain formation, moved into machine gun fire at ranges of a few hundred yards. 57,000 casualties in one day, the largest single-day loss in British military history. The offensive continued for 4.5 months. The maximum advance achieved was about 7 miles at the deepest point. The total British and Empire casualties for the Somme campaign were over 400,000. German casualties were comparable. The official reports described progress. The reports were not false exactly. Ground had been taken, enemy casualties had been inflicted. But the framing of the reports, the metrics used, the emphasis placed on what had been achieved versus what had been intended, created a version of the Somme that the command structure could present to the government and the public as a campaign that was proceeding according to plan. The men who had fought it knew something different. The 17th reality is what happened to the colonial soldiers who were brought to fight a European war. The British and French empires mobilized populations from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas to fight on the Western Front and in other theaters. More than 1 million Indian soldiers served under British command during the war. French West African soldiers, the tirailleurs sénégalais, were deployed on the Western Front in large numbers. Australian, New Zealand, Canadian and South African forces formed significant components of the British order of battle. These men were fighting a war whose causes and political stakes had been determined entirely, without their participation, in a conflict over European territorial and colonial ambitions that had no direct connection to their lives or the lives of their communities. The institutional treatment of colonial soldiers varied enormously within the single system of the empire. Australian and Canadian forces were understood and treated as soldiers of self-governing dominions with a degree of national identity that their commanders could appeal to. Indian soldiers were organized within a system that maintained a strict racial hierarchy, with Indian officers having authority only over Indian troops and European officers holding all positions of actual command. West African soldiers occupied a different position again, often perceived by the European military command as material, as a resource of bodies that France could deploy where European soldiers were not available or were being rested. The term used in French military planning for this resource, la force noire, the black force, was explicit about the nature of the assessment. The wounds and deaths of these men were recorded in the same administrative systems as European soldiers. Their pension applications went through the same processes, though the rates and conditions often differed significantly. Their bodies were buried in the same cemeteries, in many cases, or in separate sections of those cemeteries. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, established in 1917, maintained the principle of equal treatment regardless of rank or background, a principle that was advanced for its time and that was observed in some respects and departed from in others. What none of these institutional arrangements addressed was the question of why these men were here at all, in a trench in Belgium or France, dying for a political order that had not consulted them and would not substantially change its relationship to them after the war ended. The 18th reality is the specific horror of Passchendaele, officially the Third Battle of Ypres, which lasted from July to November 1917 and has become a kind of condensed symbol of everything that was worst about the Western Front. Passchendaele was fought in conditions that made almost all other conditions on the Western Front seem manageable by comparison. The Ypres salient, the bulge in the Allied line around the city of Ypres, was low-lying land that relied on a network of drainage ditches to remain passable. The preliminary British bombardment destroyed the drainage system, and then it rained. It rained for much of the campaign in quantities that were exceptional even for Flanders. The result was a battlefield that was not mud in the ordinary sense but a liquid landscape, a zone of water-saturated shell craters, collapsed trenches, and flooded ground in which movement was extraordinarily difficult and in which men and horses and equipment regularly sank. The advance toward the village of Passchendaele, which the British command had set as an objective, partly for its symbolic value, required movement across this landscape under fire. Men who were wounded and fell into the mud faced drowning if they could not be recovered quickly. The stretcher parties who attempted to move casualties across the ground struggled for hours to cover distances that would normally take minutes. Men did drown in the mud of Passchendaele. This is documented. It was not metaphorical. The mud consumed them and they could not be extracted in time. The village of Passchendaele was taken in November 1917. It was retaken by the Germans in 1918 and then retaken by the Allies again. The total advance from the initial line to Passchendaele was about 5 miles. British and Empire casualties for the campaign were somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000. The estimates vary because the conditions made accurate recording difficult. The 19th reality is what the German army experienced, because the war is sometimes told as if suffering were distributed unevenly along national lines, and it was not. German soldiers on the Western Front lived in trench systems that were in many respects better constructed than the Allied lines, because German defensive strategy had prioritized the permanence of their positions. German dugouts were deeper and more reinforced. German logistics behind the Western Front were more efficient in the early and middle phases of the war, but German soldiers were subjected to the same artillery, the same gas, the same snipers, the same trench diseases. And from 1916 onward, the German army was fighting under conditions of increasing material disadvantage as the British naval blockade restricted the supply of food, raw materials, and medical supplies to Germany. The British blockade of Germany is one of the least discussed aspects of the war in popular accounts because its effects were felt primarily by German civilians rather than German soldiers, and because its mechanisms were economic and administrative rather than violent in the immediately visible sense. The blockade restricted the import of food into Germany throughout the war. By 1917, German civilian food rations had fallen to levels that produced serious malnutrition in urban populations. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, so-called because turnips became the primary available food, saw significant excess civilian mortality. Estimates of German civilian deaths attributable to the blockade range from several hundred thousand to over 700,000. These people did not die in uniform. They did not appear in the combat casualty statistics. They died in cities and towns of diseases associated with malnutrition and of direct starvation, while the war continued in France. The 20th reality is the specific experience of soldiers who went to the war young, and what it did to their sense of time and possibility. The minimum enlistment age in Britain was officially 18. But boys of 15 and 16 enlisted in significant numbers in the early volunteer period of the war by falsifying their ages. The recruiter's question was often a formality. The institutional pressure to enlist sufficient numbers overrode the institutional obligation to verify ages. Boys who enlisted at 16 could find themselves on the Western Front before their 17th birthday, in trenches with men in their 30s and 40s, experiencing things that had no relationship to any prior frame of reference. The effect on development of this particular kind of experience is not easy to categorize. Men who survived the war and returned as young adults, 19, 20, 21, were returning from an experience that had no civilian equivalent and that could not be translated into civilian terms in any straightforward way. They had been living for months or years in an environment defined by industrial killing, by the routine proximity of death, by a particular form of male community forged under extreme pressure. Coming back to a world of ordinary domestic expectations, of jobs and courtship and the slow accumulation of a life, required a translation that many found impossible or that took years to accomplish, if it was accomplished at all. The 21st reality is the management of information at the home front and the specific machinery of censorship and propaganda that shaped what civilians understood about the war. The British government established a War Propaganda Bureau in 1914, staffed with prominent writers and intellectuals who produced material designed to sustain public support for the war. The German government had equivalent institutions. The French had their own. The propaganda varied in its approach but shared a common function, which was to maintain the conditions necessary for continued mass mobilization. The management of casualty reporting was a specific component of this. Casualty figures were reported in ways designed to minimize the psychological impact of large numbers. Deaths were listed in small batches in local newspapers. The aggregation of these numbers into the totals that appear in history books was not something readily available to a contemporary civilian reader. The individual deaths arrived as individual notifications, official telegrams, letters from officers, and the family learned what had happened to their specific person. The industrial scale of the dying was present but not easily visible. This was not accidental. The 22nd reality is the experience of prisoners of war, who occupied a position that removed them from combat, but did not remove them from the war's administrative logic. Approximately 8 million men were taken prisoner during World War I. The treatment of prisoners varied enormously based on their nationality, the national identity of their captors, the specific conditions of the camp, and the phase of the war. The Geneva Convention of 1906 established standards for the treatment of prisoners that the major belligerents had signed, and those standards were partially observed and partially ignored in ways that were specific to each situation. British prisoners in Germany experienced a range of conditions, from the relatively manageable, in camps where the Red Cross was able to deliver parcels and inspections occurred, to the genuinely brutal, in work details attached to industrial facilities and coal mines where prisoners were used as forced labor. German prisoners in British camps experienced comparable variation. Russian prisoners in German camps experienced conditions that were on average significantly worse, partly because of the volume of prisoners, partly because of the lower priority assigned to them in the allocation of resources, and partly because Russia was not in a position to enforce reciprocity. In camps where overcrowding, inadequate food, and disease coincided, mortality rates among prisoners rose sharply. These deaths also entered the administrative record. They also became numbers. The 23rd reality is what happened to soldiers who deliberately wounded themselves to escape the front, and the institutional response to this. Self-inflicted wounds were a documented feature of World War I on all sides. The most common was a wound to the hand or foot that would be disabling enough to remove the man from combat, but unlikely to be fatal. The method most commonly documented involved positioning the hand or foot in a particular way relative to the rifle muzzle, or arranging for the wound to occur in circumstances that could be attributed to enemy fire. Detection was not always possible because the physical evidence of a self-inflicted wound and an enemy-inflicted wound at close range could be identical. The military authorities of all the major belligerents treated self-inflicted wounds as a serious offense. The penalty, if convicted, could include imprisonment, reduction in pay, and loss of pension rights. In some documented cases, it included execution, though this was less common for self-inflicted wounds than for desertion. What the institutional response did not address was the question of what circumstances had produced the behavior, because addressing that question would have required acknowledging what the men in the trenches were actually experiencing. It was easier to frame self-inflicted wounds as a matter of individual moral failure than to treat them as evidence of a systemic problem with the conditions being imposed on soldiers. The 24th reality is the armistice, and specifically the 11 o'clock moment of November 11th, 1918, and what was happening in the hours and minutes before it. The armistice agreement was signed at 5 in the morning on November 11th. It was set to take effect at 11 o'clock. That left 6 hours during which both sides knew the war was ending, and during which the war continued. Artillery batteries fired throughout the morning. Machine guns continued to operate. Patrols were still going out. Men were still dying. In the 6 hours between the signing of the armistice and its implementation, several thousand men were killed on the Western Front. The American General Hunter Liggett later acknowledged that some of the attacks ordered on the morning of November 11th by American commanders were of questionable necessity. Some commanders wanted to use the last hours of the war to achieve objectives that would look favorable in reports. The institutional logic that had been running for 4 years continued running until 11 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, it stopped. The silence that followed was described by survivors as initially incomprehensible. Men who had been living with the sound of artillery for months or years experienced the absence of it as a kind of sensory shock. The war had ended, but the nervous systems of the men who had fought it had been calibrated to a different state. The adjustment did not happen at 11 o'clock. For many of them, it never fully happened. The 25th reality is what was done with the dead, and how the scale of death produced the administrative systems that now govern the memory of the war. The Imperial War Graves Commission, which became the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, was established in 1917 to ensure that soldiers killed in the war were given permanent, marked graves wherever possible. The work of the Commission's teams in the years after the war involved locating remains, identifying them where identification was possible, and burying them in cemeteries that were designed according to a consistent aesthetic principle developed by the architects Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker. The cemeteries were to have a uniform appearance. Individual graves were to have identical stone markers, regardless of the soldier's rank. The names of the unidentified were to be inscribed on memorial panels. Lutyens's Menin Gate at Ypres carries the names of 54,000 British and Empire soldiers who died in the Ypres salient and whose remains were never found or identified. The work of identifying and burying the dead of the Western Front was not complete in 1918. It was not complete in 1920. It was not complete in 1930. The Western Front still yields human remains regularly. Farmers in Belgium and France still plough up bones and shell fragments and occasionally unexploded ordnance. The Commission's teams still process newly found remains, identifying them through military artifacts, dental records when those survive, and increasingly through DNA analysis. Men who have been in the ground for more than 100 years are still being given names and graves. The administrative machine that was built to manage their deaths has been running continuously since 1917 and is still running today. The scale of death that World War I normalized has no single adequate description. 9 million soldiers killed, an unknown but comparable number of civilians. The Spanish influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919, killing between 50 and 100 million people globally, was accelerated in its spread by the movement of troops. The pandemic was not caused by the war, but the war's movement of millions of people across continents provided the conditions for transmission that the virus required. The war's effects on mortality did not end with the armistice. The treaties that ended the war, negotiated at Paris in 1919, redrew the maps of Europe and the Middle East in ways that created new instabilities. The borders drawn at Versailles, Saint-Germain, Trianon, and Sèvres produced states that contained minorities who did not want to belong to them, states that were defined by war guilt and reparations payments, states that were ethnically mixed in ways that the principle of national self-determination could not resolve. The peace that ended the war was not a stable peace. It was a postponement. The Second World War, which began 20 years after the armistice, killed roughly 6 times as many people as the first, including the industrialized murder of 6 million Jewish people in a genocide that was carried out with the administrative techniques and the institutional indifference to individual human life that World War I had helped normalize. The men who came back from the Western Front lived in a world that had been changed by what they had experienced, but that had not been changed enough to make what they had experienced comprehensible. The language for it did not exist. The psychological frameworks for it were incomplete. The social structures available for processing it, churches, families, communities, were not equipped to receive what these men carried. Some of them talked about it. Most of them did not. The silence was not dignity exactly. It was the absence of a framework adequate to the content. The 25 realities of this war are not secrets. They are documented in archives, in medical records, in regimental histories, in the letters of the men who experienced them. They are not hidden. They are simply not the version of the war that the official commemorations, the bronze statues, the November silences, the school curricula have chosen to carry forward. The version that is carried forward is the one that makes the deaths make sense, that frames the loss as sacrifice, that gives the suffering a purpose proportionate to its scale. That version is a human necessity, perhaps. The mind requires meaning, but it is not what happened. What happened was that a system was built over 4 years for the industrial processing of human beings into military objectives, and the system worked well enough to sustain itself until the conditions that had created it were exhausted. The system did not end because anyone decided it should end. It ended because both sides ran low enough on men and material and political will that continued operation became impossible. The armistice was not a moral event. It was a logistical one, and when the system stopped, it left behind its products, the dead in their hundreds of thousands of graves, the wounded in their hospitals, the survivors in their silence, and the empty space where the future of all those people had been. The war ended. The records were filed. The cemeteries were planted with grass and flowers. The commissions continued their work, and the names of the missing continued to be added to the walls of the memorials in lettering that is uniform and precise, and that makes no distinction between the man who died charging a machine gun and the man who was killed by a random shell while carrying water, because the system that recorded them made no such distinction either. They were all entered in the same columns, they were all measured in the same units, and the columns are very long.